By early 1945, Adolf Hitler's empire was collapsing at every front. The Eastern Front had turned into a rolling catastrophe as the Red Army crushed German defenses and advanced toward Berlin. In the West, American, British, and Canadian forces were pushing across the Rhine, dismantling what was left of the Wehrmacht's ability to fight. Fuel reserves were nearly gone, cities lay in ruins, and Germany's last gambles, from the Ardennes offensive to the V2 terror campaign, had failed to alter the war's outcome. Hitler was still issuing grand commands from his bunker, but even his closest circle could see that the Reich was living its final days. Amid this chaos, a series of desperate and unofficial peace feelers began circulating across Europe. Some came from German diplomats who no longer believed in Hitler's leadership. Others came from high-ranking officers who hoped to save what remained of Germany before the Soviets overran everything. And a few were quietly approved by Hitler himself, in direct attempts to see if the Western Allies might be willing to break their alliance with Stalin and negotiate a conditional end to the war. These efforts were cautious, fragmented, and mostly hidden, relying on intermediaries in Sweden, Switzerland, and even the Vatican. Hitler refused to publicly admit weakness, but behind the scenes, the Nazi leadership was terrified of a Soviet occupation. The hope, however faint, was to convince the Americans and British to accept a separate peace, allowing German forces to turn entirely against the Soviets. But the situation was far too broken. The Allies knew Germany was on the brink of total military defeat. Hitler's name was synonymous with betrayal, mass murder, and broken treaties. Even before Washington responded, the desperation behind these peace probes showed how far the once mighty Third Reich had fallen. When the first whispers of German peace feelers reached Washington in early 1945, the reaction inside the American government was cautious but alert. Intelligence channels from Switzerland, Sweden, and London began reporting the same pattern: envoys, intermediaries, and supposed private messages, hinting that certain German officials, and possibly Hitler himself, were exploring the idea of negotiation with the Western Allies. These reports landed on the desks of the U.S. High Command, the State Department, and President Roosevelt's closest advisors. America's intelligence community had learned through bitter experience that the Nazi regime was skilled at deception. From fake surrender offers to broken non-aggression promises, Hitler's government had repeatedly used diplomacy as a tactical weapon, never as a sincere gesture. So while Washington did not ignore the messages, it treated them with deep suspicion. At the Pentagon, senior officers such as General George Marshall reviewed the intelligence summaries with the same question: was this a real attempt at peace, or just another strategic trick? American commanders knew the German military was collapsing on both fronts, but they also knew Hitler still hoped to split the Allies by exploiting their ideological tension with the Soviet Union. The US and Britain had anticipated this tactic for years, ever since Hitler's propaganda machine began framing Germany as Europe's defense against Bolshevism. President Roosevelt's administration also considered the political and moral stakes. Any hint of negotiation with Hitler could undermine Allied unity, shatter trust with Moscow, and appear to the world as a betrayal of the millions suffering under Nazi occupation and genocide. In quiet meetings inside the White House and Pentagon, the reaction solidified. The reports were acknowledged, analyzed, and ultimately treated as a sign of Nazi desperation, not as the start of a diplomatic path. Washington was listening, but it was not interested in talking. Inside the headquarters of the U.S. High Command, there was no hesitation, no debate stretched across days, and no faction arguing for negotiation. The American stance formed almost immediately: the United States would not negotiate any form of peace with Hitler or the Nazi regime. Only unconditional surrender would be accepted. General George C. Marshall, America's top military leader, had spent the war enforcing a doctrine of directness and total commitment. To him, any negotiation, no matter how small, risked unraveling everything the Allies had fought for since 1939. Marshall's staff reviewed Hitler's previous diplomatic behavior. Every treaty broken, every guarantee violated, every ceasefire used as a chance to regroup and strike again. The conclusion was unanimous. Hitler could not be trusted, even in the final days of defeat. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in Western Europe, was equally firm. His intelligence officers consistently warned that Nazi Germany might try to use a fake peace offer to sow division between the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Eisenhower believed that even entertaining the idea could fracture Allied unity and prolong the war. At the political level, Roosevelt's administration reinforced the military's position. The Casablanca Conference of 1943, where Roosevelt and Churchill publicly declared unconditional surrender as the only acceptable outcome, remained the guiding principle. Backtracking now, as the Allies stood on the edge of victory, was unthinkable. Messages circulated between Washington, London, and Allied headquarters confirming the unified stance. If Germany wanted peace, it would come only through total capitulation, surrendering its armies, ending the Nazi government, and relinquishing every claim to military resistance. No conditions, no bargaining. Thus, when reports of Hitler's supposed peace feelers continued, Washington's response, formal or otherwise, was consistent: there will be no negotiations. Germany must surrender completely or continue facing the full force of the Allied advance. For American leaders in 1945, the refusal to negotiate with Hitler wasn't just a military decision, it was a moral, strategic, and political necessity. The U.S. High Command understood that Nazi Germany was not an ordinary enemy that could be trusted to honor agreements. Every major act of German diplomacy since 1933 had been built on deception. Treaties were signed only to be broken. Promises were made only to be exploited. In Washington's view, negotiating with Hitler wasn't simply risky, it was impossible. But the reasoning went far deeper. By the final year of the war, Allied forces had uncovered undeniable evidence of Nazi crimes, mass graves, extermination sites, and the horrifying conditions of liberated concentration camps. These revelations fundamentally shaped American thinking. To U.S. military and political leaders, any arrangement that allowed Hitler's regime, even a weakened version, to survive would be morally unforgivable. It would mean leaving the architects of genocide, aggression, and terror still in power. Strategically, the stakes were just as high. American planners believed that a negotiated peace would grant Germany precious time to regroup, rearm, or shift forces. Worse, it could split the Allied coalition. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin already suspected the West of seeking a separate peace with Hitler. Engaging in talks would confirm his deepest fears and potentially unravel the partnership that was crucial to defeating Nazi Germany. The US also feared a political disaster in Europe. A partial German state left intact could spark future wars or allow extremist ideologies to survive. Only unconditional surrender could guarantee that Nazism would be uprooted completely and Germany would undergo a full demilitarization and reconstruction. In the end, the American refusal was absolute. Peace without total surrender would betray the victims, destabilize the world, and risk repeating the horrors that Nazi Germany had unleashed. Washington's answer had to be final, and it was. As the final months of the war unfolded, Washington made its position unmistakably clear. There would be no deal, no negotiation, and no political lifeline for Adolf Hitler or his regime. Every intelligence cable, diplomatic reply, and Allied communication reinforced the same message: Germany must surrender unconditionally, or it would be destroyed on the battlefield. This stance was not only spoken but broadcast to the world. Public statements from President Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Allied military leaders left no room for misinterpretation. They declared repeatedly that the Axis powers would receive unconditional surrender a phrase that became the cornerstone of Allied war policy. Washington wanted the German leadership to understand that there was no hidden agenda, no secret alternative path, and no private negotiations taking place behind closed doors. Inside Germany, these messages filtered through military channels, intercepted broadcasts, and morale-shattering psychological warfare campaigns. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine and bombers pounded Germany's remaining industrial centers, many German officials desperately hoped that the Western Allies might soften their demands. But the American answer remained identical every time: Hitler's government had forfeited any right to negotiate. Even when German envoys tried to initiate personal contact through neutral countries, Sweden, Switzerland, Portugal, the Vatican, the response they received was always the same. Washington instructed intermediaries to inform any German messenger that only the terms Eisenhower's headquarters dictated would be accepted: immediate disarmament, surrender of all forces, and the complete collapse of the Nazi regime. By April 1945, as Soviet forces encircled Berlin and American troops advanced through Bavaria, the last illusion of diplomacy evaporated. Hitler realized no rescue was coming from the West. No separate peace. No compromise. His Reich had no bargaining power left. And so, the final message from Washington stood unbroken: surrender completely, or be crushed completely.